This is a moment of extraordinary awakenings and progress for the fight for justice and equality for Black people in America. There's a cynicism that might be sort of behind a lot of attitudes that young people have towards voting as well. And it strikes me that you're kind of walking proof that like you can cheat in an election or, you suppress a bunch of votes and get away with it. That like your experience actually proves that the cynics are right.
Well, I appreciate and understand and recognize the legitimacy of the cynicism. That's one of the reasons I took the unorthodox step of actually declaring that I would not concede the election. Not that I would deny that he won by rigging the system. I defy the system's existence. But the second part of what you reference is that it's insufficient to think that either voting at the ballot boxes, protesting at the ballot boxes, or protesting in the streets, that either of those things alone can accomplish our ends. We have to be a both and tactical, community. I was a protester as a young person. I believe in protest.
And today, I come to you as a young person, as a young woman, as a young Black woman, to ask you to use us, use the young people of the United States of America to pave a road that will last forever.
My parents raised me to protest, but they also raised me to go and vote because I understand that in a representative democracy, I don't need someone to just listen to me once. I need them to change the systems themselves and to ensure that my access doesn't get diminished because the wrong person gets elected. We can't dismantle a system we don't understand, and most people don't realize the scope and depth of voter suppression. And if you don't understand that, if you can't access that, then how can you dismantle it? Protest is critical. It is a valuable and, in fact, I would say invaluable part of how we create change. But to make that change permanent, it must become policy and law, and that happens only through the act of voting.
Now, in a sense, like a lot of the what was wrong with the 2018 election, the way that it was administered in Georgia, we know about now. But primary elections in 2020 in Georgia were a mess too. Usually light is the best disinfectant, right? But you know what happened in 2018 and it seems to be happening again in 2020.
So in 2018, yes, I declared what happened and a number of people saw what happened, but no one in power felt they were compelled to do anything about what happened. Let's be clear, this is a power struggle. We might call it voting, we might call it protesting. This is about power. And power is not going to concede. It's not going to walk away, oh, I've been caught, Lex Luthor is caught in the spotlight, oh, I'm going to give up. No. He goes back to his lair and he comes up with a new plan. So voting and part of protesting is that we've got to keep the pressure on, but we've also got to start replacing. We've got to start replacing those who are willing to do bad action and replacing those with those willing to do good action. And if they don't do their jobs, we replace them. But if we abdicate the system, if we say, never mind, it's never going to work, then evil gets to stay where it is and it gets stronger.
You would call this evil.
Anytime we live in a democracy, and if you are willing to strip the people of their right to have a say in their future, a future that allows you to survive an encounter with the police, a future that allows you to survive a pandemic, but if you live in the wrong community, if you are the wrong color, you're more likely to die, you're more likely to lose your job, you're more likely to face extrajudicial killings. Yes, that's evil.
But voter suppression is effectively like an explicit tactic of the GOP, not just in Georgia, but across the country.
That's why fair fight is everywhere. That's why I've been traveling the country, because I know it's not Georgia. And it's also not about politicians. One of the reasons I was very intentional about not challenging my election, that would have made this just a contest between me and Brian Kemp, and I'm a sore loser, and I'm trying to make it, I want the title. If I had done that, then this conversation would have been over in 2018. My responsibility was to say, this is bigger than me. It's bigger than any single elected official or wannabe elected official. It's about the right of a citizen to have a say in our government and to have a say in who speaks for us. My fight started in 2018 in November. You are not going to undo 20 years of bad action with 2 years of fight, but you can make change. Voting is not a magic pill. And I think we do ourselves a disservice, and those who chastise protesters do a disservice when we romanticize what voting gets us. Voting is not an instant cure for anything, but it is the only thing that creates the permanent change we need, because we have to remember that the disease we're challenging, whether that disease is structural racism, police brutality, systemic inequities. Those diseases will metastasize if we do not tackle them. And the way we tackle them is through the treatment of elections and the treatment of protest. But we have to do both and. This is not a nation where either or wins.
So let's talk about the Republicans for a second, because I think voting is such a complicated issue in different states. There are different rules, there are different legal challenges. And I don't think it's unfair to say that chaos, to a degree, is a Republican strategy, which is to say, litigate as much as you can, try to delay any reforms that might make things easier to vote. How do you wage a fair fight with people who play by a different set of rules and whose, yes, grip on power, so to speak, depends on those rules not being reformed towards more inclusive voting? Like, it's an unfair fight.
Well, it's never a fair fight. But my job is to try to make it as fair as possible. And here's how you start.
But my question is how? Yeah, how do you do it?
Number one, you acknowledge that there's a fight. Because you got to remember, prior to 2018, people didn't really talk about voter suppression very much. We whispered about it. We knew it existed. But if you think back to the 2016 election, did we have the sustained conversation about voter suppression that we're having today? The answer is absolutely not. And I am proud of the role that I have played in helping make this a national conversation. That's number one. Number two, when the pandemic started, there were only 34 states in our country that permitted mail-in ballots. As of today, there are 42. We got 8 to go. That is dramatic progress. We have states that did not want to let people vote in the pandemic safely from their homes, and we have changed not just the narrative, we've changed the laws, because we're also fighting in the courts. We're also fighting in the legislature. Nevada had a terrible election on the same day that Georgia's debacle of a primary happened. But the difference was because there is a Democratic legislature and a Democratic governor and a Republican Secretary of State, the state of Nevada just passed new laws to change the system. And
but the RNC sued. The RNC has sued, and I believe maybe the Trump campaign's going to sue as well. So, and that can get dragged out until who knows when, right? So this is part of the...
Well, no. Let's be clear about what happened. That suit that they have filed, right now, that suit is, they're trying. We try too. The issue is, where are we? Because we know that 4 years ago, if Nevada had done the exact same thing, there wouldn't have been a lawsuit. It would have stood as the law because there were not Democrats in office willing to challenge and push back.
Well, so I guess the question is, the RNC has millions of dollars in the tank to do precisely this, to challenge through litigation certain reforms. Do you guys have the same amount?
Absolutely. So Fair Fight has two pieces. One part is our C4 work, which is research, nonpartisan, and just pushing for good democracy. But we have Fair Fight 2020, which is a well-funded national organization that put millions of dollars into states to help do this work. And we weren't alone. You've got Priorities USA, you've got American Bridge, you've got groups that in different ways are pushing back against the Republican machine, because you're absolutely right. In the 21st century, voter suppression has been the province of Republicans. And what has not previously happened was an organized strategy by those who believe in expansion of democracy to actually put the resources behind it. That's not the case, and that's why they're panicked. That's why the president of the United States lied about whether or not vote by mail works and suddenly declared that Florida is the only state in the nation where you can vote by mail or absentee. We're winning not just the war of ideas, we're winning the litigation wars, which is why we now have 42 states doing the right thing. And every single day we are seeing progress. But progress is temporary until you change the people making the laws, or until you change the laws in such a way that undoing those laws is nearly impossible. And that's my fight.
One thing you wrote in your book was that voter suppression is no longer done by cops with billy clubs or, dogs being sicked on people, but it's by voter ID laws. I want to turn your attention to something that the mayor of Seattle said last week, something along the lines of the federal agents that we're seeing in cities in the US have troubling implications for voter suppression. Is that a concern that you share?
Oh, absolutely. And we've been ringing this alarm bell for the last year. In 2017, the RNC was freed from basically a 35-year consent decree that said they could not engage in voter intimidation as a national issue. They now can. We know they intend to send off-duty officers. We know they intend to have off-duty ICE officers and have bands of people who are intimidating voters in line. We know that's going to come, but for the first time, we're ready to fight back.
Let's turn our attention to the Democratic Party, because it's a time of great upheaval within the party itself, and it's, during the convention, I'm sure there's going to be a lot about the platform, about what what the Democratic Party looks like in the next 4, 8, 10 years. If a President Biden happens, he's even described himself as something of a transitionary figure, a bridge to a new Democratic Party. My question to you is what do you think that party looks like on the other side of the bridge?
Well, I think we have to start with the story we tell on this side of the bridge, which is why I'm also working so hard through my organization, Fair Count, to ensure that we have an accurate census. Because let's remember, the Republicans aren't just thinking about this election, they're thinking about the election in 2030 and the election in 2040 when we become a majority-minority nation, because race is the strongest predictor of political leanings. And so they're trying to rig the census in this year to guide and govern the next 10 years of elected opportunity. I am not a Democrat because of what I'm told. I'm a Democrat because of what I do. And that's the mission I think we have to have as a party writ large, engaging people where they are so they understand what they need and they have the tools to build it. Because we do not elect saviors in this country. We elect workers, people who are supposed to do their jobs for us. And if they don't do their jobs, they don't deserve to have them.
People who came to office as seeming like saviors of a sort. You were very critical in your book of the Obama-Biden presidency in their early days of not ensuring voter protections, of not expanding the electorate by way of immigration reform. Do you think that if there is a Biden presidency, that of the multiplicity of issues that need to be tackled on day one, that voting rights should be high on the list?
Well, I wouldn't characterize my book that way. When the Obama presidency began, we had the Voting Rights Act. And for many people, the Voting Rights Act, because it had been reaffirmed by a unanimous vote under a Republican president, there wasn't a real sense that there was a threat. I'm just suspicious because I live in the South. So what I saw happening was not necessarily a national conversation. But I do believe that we have to recognize the necessity of taking immediate action to solidify any opportunities we have. And so the first step I hope the Congress takes is to do what Nancy Pelosi did with the first act that Congress took in 2017, which is to pass H.R. 1 and pass H.R. 4 now, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We have to first solidify our democracy.
But what about expanding the electorate? Because, even a state like Georgia, there are a lot of brown folks there that just don't count as Americans for whatever reason. Comprehensive immigration reform hasn't happened. It's at a point where there are millions of people who live in this country who could be members of our electorate and democracy that aren't. How important is it to you that a Biden administration does these sorts of things in the first 100 days?
It's absolutely important. If you look at the campaign I ran for governor, I spoke very openly and very impassionedly about the need for us to ensure that we remove this specter and this sort of Damocles over so many community members. It's why I oppose the 287G program. It's why I'm a very strong proponent of immediate action on immigration. But I will say the first thing we have to do is we have to pass those laws that solidify our democracy, because the problem we have is we pass laws and think they're permanent. If we don't actually secure the right to vote for every eligible American, including returning citizens who were ex-offenders, if we do not make it possible for those newly cemented Americans, if they get access to citizenship, for that voice to be real, then we're going to have this conversation again in a decade.
And on the concept of progressivism, there is a bit of a conversation within the Democratic Party about how to reform police. Obviously, it's up there as far as a huge conversation. Joe Biden doesn't want to defund the police, but certain people do in the party, like a person like Cori Bush, who won the primary in Missouri. So part of the party is moving towards and animating voters with policies like defund the police. Joe Biden saying we should give police more money. Where do you stand on that? And what do you think the direction the party should go, and what's right?
I believe in the combination of reformation and transformation. We have to reform how public safety is administered. That means incorporating all of the pieces of the George Floyd Policing Act, making certain that we actually not only provide strictures for how police can operate, but we've got to demilitarize. We have to pull back on funding for police departments and law enforcement departments writ large that are not meeting appropriate standards. And we have to have higher standards for what is permitted. We need to end qualified immunity. That's reformation.
Sure, but we're talking about defunding though, right? So the money.
we also need transformation. Transformation is how we spend our resources. And that means that we have to spend our money not simply on this notion of public safety, but actually making the public safe through housing, through education, through investment in community reforms. We have to do both and. And my responsibility is not to admonish or try to co-opt the language of protesters. Our responsibility, anyone in policy, is the job is not to try to use someone's language or police their language, but to actually make those changes. And part of the reason I'm so exercised about the census is that if you look at what happened in Minneapolis overnight, if we do not do the census properly, they will be able to redraw the lines in Minneapolis so that those city council members who are willing to take a step to start to do more, they will lose their jobs. They will do the same thing in Louisville because of what was done for Breonna Taylor. So we have to not simply fight the messaging war, we've got to fight the tactical battle of making sure we can elect folks like Cori Bush. We can elect people like those who sit on the Minneapolis City Council and the Louisville City Council. We've got to elect DAs in Georgia who will actually charge the people who murdered Ahmaud Arbery. Those are things we have to fight at the same time. We've got to do reformation and transformation at the exact same time. And I don't believe that this is I think it's a false choice when we say we have to do one or the other. This has to be both and, where we spend our money, but also how we hold law enforcement accountable.
So just to confirm, you're not for defunding the police?
That's not at all what I said. I'm not using, I was a protester long enough that I don't believe in co-opting or trying to say what I think is meant by the language of protest. I'm telling you what I would do as a policymaker, because that's the context of the conversation. And in that context, we have to do the reforms necessary to make certain not just extrajudicial killings don't happen. We've got to make certain that when you show up we just saw this when that family in Aurora, Colorado was pulled over. We've got to address the issue, not simply of brutality, but how do they approach a car? How do they make decisions about how they treat people when there's legitimate crime that has taken place? So we have to have reformation of how law enforcement does its job, but we also have to shift our priorities of how we spend our money. I believe in both and. I don't think it's an either or conversation.
Would you be interested in being President Joe Biden's Attorney General?
I am focused on making sure there is a President Joe Biden from the beginning.
What's your message to Black Americans who are probably going to have to wait in line for hours, who might have to skip work, arrange childcare, maybe even risk infection to cast a ballot that they don't even know will get counted in some cases? What's your message to people who have to go through that?
This is a message to Black Americans, Latinos, to young people, to every community that is seen as an obstacle to the holding on of power, to some in the Republican Party who refuse to fix their ideas rather than fix the game. My answer is it's going to be hard, it's going to be mean, and we're going to do everything in our power to ensure that you have as many options as possible. But this is an existential threat to our existence in this country. If they are able to erase us from the census and eliminate our voices from our democracy, then we are done. And I refuse to let that happen. And so I just pray for their patience and pray for their health. But we have to persevere.